The morning sun had just begun to paint the lake with streaks of gold when David stepped onto his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, expecting another quiet start to his day. For years, his mornings had been the same, calm, peaceful, predictable. The birds sang, the air smelled of dew and pine, and the steady hum of sprinklers from nearby houses filled the silence. But this morning, the calm ended the moment his eyes reached the edge of his yard. His wooden fence, his sturdy, weather-stained, 10-year-old fence, was gone. Not broken. Not damaged. Gone. Every post, every plank, every nail that once divided his property from his neighbor's lawn had vanished. For a long moment, David just stood there, his coffee cooling in his hand as his brain tried to make sense of what he was seeing. His yard now blended seamlessly with his neighbor's. The same slope of grass, the same soil, as if the two had always been one. And standing right there, on the other side, was Karen. She wore a silk robe, sunglasses, and a wide grin, sipping from a tall glass of orange juice like someone admiring a victory. When she noticed him, she waved casually. "Good morning, David," she said, her voice chipper and sweet in a way that instantly put him on edge. "Lovely view, isn't it?" David blinked, confusion giving way to disbelief. "Karen," he said slowly, "where's my fence?" She tilted her head slightly, as if he'd asked something silly. "Oh, that old thing? It was blocking my lake view. I had it removed. You're welcome." The words hit him like a slap. "You had it removed?" he repeated, trying to process it. "You mean, you tore down my fence?" Karen sipped her drink, unfazed. "Well, not me personally. I hired people. They were very efficient. Took them only 3 hours." She gestured toward a small crew of workers near the waterline, gathering leftover wood pieces and tossing them into a dumpster. David's stomach tightened. "That fence was on my property, Karen." She smiled wider, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Oh, I don't think so. It looked like it was over the line. My landscaper said so." "Your landscaper isn't the county assessor," David said sharply. "That fence has been in the same spot for 10 years. I built it with the HOA's approval." Karen shrugged. "Well, maybe the HOA changed their mind. Anyway, now we all have a better view of the lake. You should thank me." David's grip on his mug tightened until his knuckles went white. "You had no right to touch my property," he said. Karen's smile turned smug. "It's just a fence, David. Don't be dramatic." The crew finished their work, laughing among themselves as they left. David watched in silence, every muscle in his body tense. The open stretch of land between their homes felt wrong now, exposed and violated. It wasn't just a fence, it was a line of respect, and she had bulldozed it like it meant nothing. He turned and walked back inside before saying something he'd regret. Inside, he grabbed his phone and dialed the HOA number. After 3 rings, a bored voice answered. "Homeowners Association, this is Carol." "Hi, Carol, it's David Turner, from Lakeview Circle. My neighbor just destroyed my fence, literally bulldozed it last night." There was a pause, then a sigh. "Do you have photos?" "Photos? The fence is gone." "We'll need photos of the damage for record-keeping," she said flatly. "I can come by later this week." "Later this week?" David snapped. "She tore down my property line. I need this addressed now." "Sir, please calm down," Carol said, her tone distant and rehearsed. "We'll investigate and let you know." Then she hung up. David stood there, staring at the phone screen, the words "will investigate" echoing in his mind like an insult. Outside, Karen's laughter drifted across the yard. She was talking to her friends, 2 other HOA members who lived nearby. Their voices carried easily over the now fenceless property. "I told you," Karen said. "It makes my yard look so much bigger. And now I have a clear view of the lake from my porch. Finally." "Won't David be upset?" one of her friends asked, laughing. "He already is," Karen replied. "But he'll get over it. He's so uptight about property lines. It's not like he owns the lake." The women laughed, clinking their glasses together. David closed his blinds and sat at his table, anger simmering beneath his calm. He wasn't a man who liked confrontation. He had moved to this neighborhood for peace, for quiet mornings and slow days. But this was an invasion. That evening, when the sun dipped low, David walked the edge of his yard, tracing where the fence had stood. The grass beneath his boots showed faint lines where the posts had been. He could almost see the ghost of his fence, standing proud as before. Now it was gone, and the border between his home and Karen's was a blur. Near the edge, he noticed something new: flower pots. 6 of them, neatly lined up along the invisible boundary. All of them sitting squarely on his side. Karen had moved in, quite literally. The nerve of it made his pulse quicken. He took pictures of everything, every flower pot, every shovel mark, every disturbed patch of dirt. He knew then that this wasn't going to end with a simple argument or a neighborly apology. Karen wasn't the kind of person who admitted fault. She was the kind who pushed until everyone else gave up. But David wasn't going to give up. Not this time. That night, he sat at his desk with a glass of whiskey and began researching. He pulled up the county property database, searching for parcel maps, legal boundaries, and land coordinates. His property line was crystal clear. The fence had been right where it should be, 3 feet inside his lot. Karen's claim was baseless. Still, he knew logic alone wouldn't stop her. People like her didn't fear reason. They feared consequences. He opened another tab and searched for property law attorneys. Most were expensive, but he didn't care. He'd work extra hours, sell his fishing boat if he had to. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about principle. The next morning, he noticed Karen outside again. She was directing 2 workers, pointing toward his backyard. They were marking lines with spray paint. He walked over calmly, camera in hand. "What are you doing now?" he asked. Karen turned, feigning surprise. "Oh, just expanding my garden. Don't worry, it's still my yard." "It's not your yard," David said firmly. "You've already crossed the property line." She laughed lightly. "Oh, come on, David. You're not really going to make a big deal about this, are you? It's just grass." "Grass I pay taxes for," he said coldly. "Move your things back before I get the county involved." "You wouldn't dare," she said, stepping closer, her smile vanishing. "The HOA will side with me." "Maybe," he said, pulling out his phone and snapping a photo of her workers spraying paint on his lawn. "But the law won't." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You really think you can win against me?" "I don't need to win," he said quietly. "I just need to be right." He turned and walked away as she stood there fuming. That night, David gathered his photos, property documents, and every HOA email he'd ever received. He organized everything into a neat folder labeled evidence. His anger had burned down into something sharper, a focused resolve. He knew the HOA would drag its feet, that Karen would keep pushing. But he also knew something Karen didn't. He had patience. And patience was the one weapon she'd never understand. Late that evening, a storm rolled over the lake. Thunder rumbled softly in the distance, and rain began to fall, washing over the yard that no longer had a fence. David stood at the window, watching as water pooled along the property line, turning the soil into mud. He could see Karen's flower pots tilting, the dirt washing out from beneath them. It felt like nature itself was erasing her arrogance. For a long time, he stood there, watching the rain blur the space between their lands, until the line disappeared completely. But in his mind, that invisible boundary had never been clearer. He whispered quietly to himself, "You wanted a view, Karen. Now you'll get to see what happens next." And as the lightning cracked across the sky, he made a silent promise. This wouldn't end with anger or shouting. It would end with a signature, his victory written in ink and law, not words. That night, long after the storm passed, David's computer screen glowed in the dark. The cursor blinked over a search bar reading property encroachment legal action. He typed the final words slowly, deliberately, how to reclaim property taken by a neighbor. Then he hit enter. The HOAs silenced the morning after the storm. David woke up early, the ground outside still wet and muddy, the air smelling of rain and soil. He stepped out with his camera and took more pictures of the yard. The flower pots Karen had smugly placed on his land were now half sunk in the mud, the bright flowers drooping as if even nature had taken his side. He measured the line again, careful and precise, marking where his fence once stood. His anger had settled into something colder now. Resolve. He dressed neatly, packed his photos and documents into a binder, and drove to the HOA office. The small brick building sat near the entrance of the neighborhood, with a flag fluttering above it and a sign that read, "Preserving Harmony in the Community." The irony made him scoff. Inside, he found the HOA board gathered for their monthly meeting. At the center sat Mrs. Green, the HOA president, a stern woman who spoke like she was running a courtroom. Karen was there too, of course, sitting in the front row with her sunglasses perched on her head and that same smug smile plastered on her face. When David entered, a few people murmured. Everyone had heard the rumors already. He took a seat, waiting for his turn, feeling the weight of every eye on him. When Mrs. Green finally called his name, he stood, holding his binder tightly. "My fence was illegally destroyed," he began calmly. "My neighbor, Karen, hired a crew to remove it without permission. They trespassed on my land, and she's now using part of my property as her own." Karen let out a soft laugh. "Oh, please," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "It wasn't his land. The fence was crooked. Everyone knew it. I just fixed what he should have done years ago." David ignored her, setting his documents on the table. "I have proof of the original boundary line, approved by the HOA and verified by the county. The fence was exactly where it was supposed to be." He slid the photos forward. Mrs. Green flipped through them without expression. "Mr. Turner, the HOA is not responsible for disputes between neighbors unless it violates visual guidelines or shared structures. We can issue a review, but it will take time." "Time," David repeated, his tone tightening. "You think this is about aesthetics? She tore down private property. You approved that fence yourselves." One of the board members, an older man with glasses, spoke up. "Maybe it's a misunderstanding. These things happen. Sometimes boundaries shift." "Boundaries don't shift," David said, his patience thinning. "People do." Karen leaned back, crossing her legs. "David, you're overreacting. The fence was ugly anyway. It blocked my view of the lake, and I'm sure others agree." A few members exchanged awkward glances. One even nodded slightly, which made David's stomach turn. He realized something then. Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was friends with the board. They attended the same parties, volunteered at the same events. She had influence. "This isn't about how the fence looked," David said, his voice steady but sharp. "It's about property rights. She broke the law." Mrs. Green sighed. "We'll need time to investigate before making any decisions. For now, I suggest you both avoid further conflict." David clenched his jaw. "So that's it? You'll investigate while she keeps trespassing on my land?" "That's the procedure," Mrs. Green said firmly. "You'll be notified of any updates." Karen smiled sweetly. "See, David? Let's just move on. It's not like I took your house." David didn't respond. He gathered his binder and left the meeting room, ignoring the quiet whispers that followed him out. As he walked toward the parking lot, he heard Karen's voice behind him, playful and cruel. "Face it, everyone likes my view better." He stopped but didn't turn around. He just said softly, "Enjoy it while it lasts." He drove home with his mind racing. He had hoped the HOA would act like the law-abiding authority they claimed to be. But now he saw the truth. They were useless, maybe even corrupt. They didn't care about fairness, only convenience. That night, David sat on his porch, watching the lake shimmer under the setting sun. Karen's laughter drifted from her yard, where she was hosting a small get-together. He could hear them joking, calling him the fence guy and mocking his complaints. Each laugh hit him like a hammer. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. Anger wouldn't solve this. Logic would. He opened his laptop again, this time researching property law, fence regulations, and boundary dispute cases. He read about something called adverse possession and property encroachment, laws that could work in his favor if he played it right. The more he read, the clearer his plan became. He found the name of a local property lawyer with a reputation for handling tough HOA cases. The next morning, he called the lawyer and explained everything. The man on the other end chuckled darkly. "Sounds like your neighbor messed with the wrong homeowner," he said. "If what you're telling me is true, we can do more than rebuild your fence. We can make her pay for the land she's using." "Legally?" David asked. "Completely," the lawyer said. "But you'll need proof, measurements, photos, and a certified survey report." "I'll get all of it," David said. After the call, he reached out to a land surveyor. Within 2 days, a white truck pulled up to his driveway. The surveyor, a quiet man named Glenn, got to work immediately, driving metal stakes into the soil, taking readings, marking lines with neon spray paint. Karen watched from her window, scowling. Later, she walked outside, pretending to water her plants. "What's all this, David?" she asked with fake sweetness. "Just confirming something," he said. "You seem nervous." "I'm not nervous," she snapped. "I just think you're wasting your money." "Maybe," he said, "but at least I'll know what's mine." By sunset, the surveyor handed him the results. The report confirmed what David already knew. Karen had built over 3 feet into his land. "It's clear as day," Glenn said. "If you want, I'll notarize this for court use." David nodded, a small spark of satisfaction lighting inside him. "Do it." When Karen saw the new boundary markers cutting through her lawn, she stormed over, furious. "You can't just redraw the line," she yelled. "That's my garden." "No," David said. "That's my property. I'll call the HOA." "Go ahead," he said calmly. "I already did. They're taking their time. I'm not." She glared at him, speechless for once, before stomping back to her house. David watched her go, then looked at the bright orange flags fluttering in the grass. For the first time since his fence disappeared, he felt control return to his hands. He smiled faintly. This wasn't going to end in shouting or threats. It was going to end on paper, with signatures, seals, and a victory she'd never see coming. That night, as the moon rose over the lake, he opened his laptop again and drafted a simple note for himself. "She took my fence. I'll take her land." The legal blueprint the next morning was calm, but David's mind wasn't. He had spent the whole night going over the survey report again and again, memorizing every inch, every number, every measurement that proved Karen had stolen part of his land. The evidence was perfect, undeniable. But he wasn't rushing to confront her. No, this time he wanted to play it smart. Karen had made the mistake of acting without thinking, but David was about to do the opposite. He was going to act so carefully that she wouldn't even realize she had lost until it was too late. He sat at his kitchen table, spreading out the documents like a battle map. His coffee grew cold as he outlined his next steps: legal notice, property adjustment filing, and ownership transfer. He made a few calls, first to the surveyor to confirm the report was notarized and ready, then to his lawyer. "We're all set," the lawyer said over the phone. "Once we file this claim, the county will review the boundary violation. If she doesn't dispute it properly, and from what you've told me, she can't, you'll legally own the strip of land she's standing on. That includes anything built or placed there." David leaned back in his chair, a slow smile forming. "So the land under her flower pots, her little patio decorations, and the part where she extended her garden, would belong to you," the lawyer finished. "Legally and permanently." "Perfect," David said. He hung up and looked out the window toward Karen's yard. She was out there again, in her wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses, arranging furniture closer to the lake. She was humming to herself, oblivious to the storm she had started. A week ago, he might have confronted her, demanded she rebuild the fence, but now he didn't need to. He would win with silence, paperwork, and patience. That night, he printed every photo and scanned every document, putting them in a single folder labeled Boundary Correction Claim. The next morning, he drove to the county courthouse and handed the folder to the clerk. She checked the papers carefully, stamped them, and said, "Processing time is usually 7 business days. You'll be notified once the review is complete." 7 days. That was all he needed. When he got home, Karen was outside again, chatting with 2 neighbors. She was showing them the open view, bragging about how nice it looked without that ugly fence. One of the neighbors nodded politely, but David could tell they were uncomfortable. He parked his truck and walked to his porch without saying a word. Karen smirked. Back from complaining to the HOA again. "David?" she called out. He looked at her calmly. "No," he said, "just taking care of some paperwork." "Oh?" she said, tilting her head. "Finally selling your house?" "No," he replied, "just expanding it." She frowned at that, but he went inside without another word. The following days passed quietly, almost too quietly. Karen went about her routine as usual, planting new flowers and adding chairs near the lake. She even installed a small wooden trellis near what used to be the fence line, making it look like part of her backyard. Every time David saw her doing it, he smiled a little more. It was like watching someone build on quicksand. They didn't realize what they were standing on until it swallowed them whole. On the 5th day, he received a letter from the county office confirming that the boundary adjustment request had been reviewed and approved. It included the official property map showing the new legal division. 3 feet of Karen's yard, now his. The paper even had the county seal embossed on it. He read it twice, savoring every word. The letter also noted that Karen would receive her copy of the notice by mail. That meant the clock had just started ticking. By the next morning, Karen's attitude had changed. David was on his porch drinking coffee when he saw her storming toward him, waving a piece of paper. "What is this?" she shouted, her voice cracking with disbelief. "You can't do this." David took a sip, unbothered. "Do what?" "You filed for a boundary adjustment," she yelled. "They sent me this letter saying you're claiming part of my land." "Not your land," David said calmly. "Mine. You just didn't know it yet." She glared at him, her face red. "This is ridiculous. I'll sue you." "You're welcome to try," he said, standing up. "But you might want to check your property survey first. You'll find that your patio and garden are sitting right on my side." She froze. "That's impossible. My landscaper measured everything." "Then maybe your landscaper should get a refund," David said coolly. "Because the county doesn't make mistakes." She stood there, gripping the letter tightly, her lips trembling. "You think this is over? I'll call the HOA. I'll make sure they fine you for harassment." "Go ahead," he said, turning to walk back inside. The HOA loves paperwork, but the law loves evidence. The door shut softly behind him, leaving Karen fuming on the sidewalk. The next few days were chaos. Karen called the HOA, but they were powerless now. It was a county matter. She called her lawyer, but once he saw the survey and documents, even he admitted she had no legal ground to fight on. She screamed at workers to move her flower pots and patio chairs back, but it was too late. The new property line was official, recorded, and permanent. David watched the whole meltdown from his window, not with cruelty, but with quiet satisfaction. She had taken his fence, thinking she could erase the line between their properties, but instead she had drawn it deeper, and this time, on his terms. On the 6th day, an official from the county arrived to place small metal stakes along the new border. Karen stood in her yard watching helplessly as they hammered the posts into the ground. Each one marked the inch she had lost. When the last stake went in, the official handed David the confirmation slip. "Everything's filed," the man said. "You're the legal owner of that strip now. Congratulations." "Thank you," David said, shaking his hand. As the official left, Karen approached him again, her voice trembling with fury and desperation. "You think you've won, don't you?" she hissed. "You just wait. I'll rebuild that fence myself if I have to." "You won't need to," David said, "because next week, I'll be building a new one, 3 feet over." You can't, she shouted. That'll block my view again. He smiled faintly. That's the idea. She stood there, speechless, before turning and storming back to her house. For the first time in weeks, David felt peace return. That evening, as the sun dipped below the lake, he stood at the edge of his property, the orange stakes glinting in the fading light. His land was his again, not by force or shouting, but by strategy and patience. He thought of how she had laughed at him, called him the fence man who cried property. Now, she would have plenty of time to admire the view she fought so hard for, from behind his new fence. The outrage the following morning, David was woken by the sound of shouting. Through his window, he saw Karen pacing her yard like a furious storm, waving her phone and yelling at someone on a call. Her voice carried across the open space. I don't care what the documents say, she shouted. He can't just take my property. Do something. She paused, listening, then screamed again, then find someone who can, and ended the call. Moments later, she turned toward David's house and glared as if she could burn holes through the walls. David calmly walked outside with his coffee, pretending not to notice her rage. The air was cool, but the tension between their yards felt like fire. Good morning, Karen, he said lightly. Beautiful day. Don't play nice with me, she snapped, marching toward the property line. You're a thief. You stole my yard. David took a slow sip of his coffee. You mean the yard you built over my land? She pointed at the new metal stakes marking the boundary. This is insane. That's my patio. My flowers. I paid for all of this. Then you should have checked your survey before tearing down my fence, he said evenly. Actions have consequences. Her face flushed red, her lips trembling. You think you're so clever, hiding behind your paperwork. You tricked me. I didn't trick you, David said. I warned you. You ignored me. Big difference. She crossed her arms tightly. This isn't over. I'm calling my lawyer again. I'll fight this in court. You can try, he said, turning to go back inside. But the law already decided. He closed his door gently, leaving her fuming on the grass. From the window, he could see her stomping her feet in frustration like a child denied a toy. By noon, she had called 3 people from the HOA, demanding an emergency meeting. 2 board members arrived at her house later that afternoon, Mr. Lopez and Mrs. Green. David watched from his porch as they stood in Karen's yard, listening to her exaggerated version of events. She waved her arms dramatically, pointing at his house. He filed some secret claim and stole my land, she said. The HOA needs to reverse it. Mrs. Green frowned. Karen, we can't overrule a county decision. You're the HOA. You have authority. Karen snapped. We have authority over fences and community rules, not legal property lines, Mr. Lopez said gently. If the county confirmed it, there's nothing we can do. You're useless, she yelled and stormed off toward her house. The 2 board members exchanged a glance, muttered something, and left quietly. Later that evening, David got a text from Mrs. Green. For what it's worth, I reviewed the documents. You were right. She brought this on herself. David replied simply, appreciate it. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. But he couldn't help the small smile that crept onto his face. It wasn't victory he felt. It was relief. For the first time since that morning his fence disappeared, the balance had shifted. Karen wasn't the queen of the neighborhood anymore. She was the woman who lost part of her property because of her own arrogance. Still, he knew Karen well enough to realize she wouldn't back down easily. The next morning, as he stepped outside, he found something on his porch, a letter folded neatly in an envelope. He opened it and read the first line, cease and desist. You are trespassing on my property. He laughed quietly. The letter was from Karen's lawyer, printed on cheap letterhead, claiming David had unlawfully altered property boundaries. He walked back inside, scanned the letter, and sent it to his lawyer with a note, round 2. Within an hour, his lawyer replied, already handled. She doesn't have a case. Sit back and relax. And so he did. But Karen didn't. That afternoon, while David worked in his garage, he heard heavy machinery outside. When he stepped out, he froze. Karen had hired a small bulldozer again, the same kind she had used before, and was shouting at the driver. "Move it back. The fence line was here," she yelled, pointing at the grass. David felt his blood pressure rise. He walked toward her slowly, phone already recording. "Karen, stop," he said firmly. "You're about to commit a second offense." "You stole my land," she screamed. "I'm taking it back." The driver looked uncertain. Are you sure this is legal?" "Do it," she snapped. "I'm paying you, aren't I?" David stood right in front of the machine. "You start that engine," he said to the driver, "and I'll call the sheriff for property destruction and trespassing." The man hesitated, glancing between them. "I think I'm gonna leave," he muttered, turning off the ignition. Karen shouted after him, but he was already backing away. "Coward!" she screamed. "You can't do this, David. I'll dig it up myself." She stomped over to her garden, grabbing a shovel and jamming it into the soil like she was at war. Dirt flew everywhere as she tried to dig out the boundary stakes. David simply called the county office, explained the situation, and they promised to send an enforcement officer immediately. When the officer arrived 30 minutes later, Karen was still shouting, covered in dirt, trying to pull a stake from the ground. The officer said, "You're damaging county property. Those markers are legal boundaries. You can't touch them." "They are wrong," she yelled, pointing at David. "He's lying." The officer held up a document. "The county records disagree. If you continue, you'll be charged with tampering." Karen froze, staring at him in disbelief. "You're siding with him." "We're siding with the law." David stood nearby, silent but watchful. The officer turned to him. "Mr. Turner, we'll note her actions in our report. If she damages anything else, call us directly." "Will do," David said. Karen dropped the shovel, her hands trembling. For the first time, she looked truly defeated. The officer left, and Karen stumbled back toward her porch, muttering angrily. She slammed her door shut, and the neighborhood fell silent again. That night, David received another email from his lawyer. "Congratulations. County confirmed her tampering violation. It strengthens your ownership claim. She's officially out of legal options." David leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. It was finally over, legally, officially, permanently. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen would still try something out of spite. He looked out the window toward her darkened house. The curtains were closed, but he could almost feel her glare through them. He smiled faintly. "You took my fence," he murmured, "and now I own your yard." The words felt good, solid, final. He turned off the lights, ready to sleep for the first time in weeks without anger in his chest. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end of Karen's pride. It was only the start of her downfall. The turning point the next few days felt strangely calm, the kind of quiet that usually came before another storm. David used the silence wisely. He cleaned up the yard, organized his paperwork, and even took a walk around the neighborhood. Most of the neighbors smiled at him now. Some even stopped to talk. "You did the right thing," one older woman said. "She's been bossing people around for years. Someone needed to stand up to her." Another neighbor chuckled. Karen finally met her match. Their support meant something to David, but he didn't let it go to his head. He knew people liked to switch sides fast in HOA neighborhoods. Today they were cheering him. Tomorrow they might whisper behind his back. Still, the atmosphere had changed. Karen's house, once the center of attention, now sat quiet with her blinds drawn tight. She wasn't hosting parties anymore or walking around giving orders. For the first time, she was avoiding everyone. But David wasn't fooled. He had seen that kind of silence before during his years managing projects. When someone wasn't talking, they were plotting. So he stayed alert. 2 evenings later, just as the sun was setting and the lake reflected the orange sky, Karen came to his door. Her voice was soft when she called out, "David, can we talk?" He opened the door cautiously, half expecting her to start shouting again, but she didn't. She looked tired, nervous even, like she had been rehearsing her words. "I don't want to fight anymore," she said. "Maybe we can work something out." He raised an eyebrow. "After everything you've done?" "I admit I went too far," she said, forcing a weak smile. "But losing that section of my yard, it's humiliating. Everyone's talking about it. You got what you wanted, so can't we just stop this?" "Stop what?" he asked, folding his arms. "You mean the consequences of your actions?" Her expression hardened slightly. "Don't make it sound like I'm the only one at fault." "You destroyed my fence," he said, his tone calm but sharp. "You lied to the HOA. You called me a thief. Then you tried to dig up county property. And now you want to pretend it's even." She looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "I just want my peace back," she whispered. "Then you should have thought about that before you bulldozed mine," he replied. She sighed deeply, shaking her head. "You're not going to forgive me, are you?" "Forgiveness is earned," he said simply, "not demanded." She left without another word, walking away slowly, her head bowed. David watched her go, then shut his door. He knew her sudden change of tone wasn't about guilt, it was about fear. Her reputation was ruined, her pride shattered, and now she was desperate to control the story before it spread further. But it was already too late. The next morning, Karen's meltdown reached its peak. She sent a long, furious message to the HOA's community group chat, accusing David of abusing the legal system and harassing an elderly widow. The message backfired instantly. Dozens of neighbors responded, reminding everyone of what she had done. Tearing down his fence, trespassing, screaming at officials. Some even posted screenshots of her earlier comments bragging about removing the fence for the community's benefit. Within an hour, the entire neighborhood chat turned against her. Mrs. Green, the HOA president, finally stepped in. "Karen," she wrote firmly, "your behavior violates HOA ethics and has damaged community trust. You are hereby suspended from board activities pending review." That was the final blow. Karen's power was gone. She was no longer the loud voice that everyone listened to. She was the example everyone whispered about. David didn't celebrate. He simply read the messages and closed the app. Sometimes the best revenge was letting the truth speak for itself. But Karen wasn't done yet. That same evening, as David sat on his porch watching the lake, he heard the crunch of gravel. A white SUV pulled into Karen's driveway. Out stepped a man in a suit, carrying a briefcase. They talked for a long time near her porch, their voices low but tense. David watched quietly. Eventually, the man handed her a stack of papers, then got back into his car and drove off. Karen stood there holding the papers, her hands trembling. She looked toward David's house for a moment, her expression full of fury and fear, then went back inside. The next morning, David got a call from his lawyer. "Thought you'd like to know," the lawyer said. "Karen tried to file a counterclaim. Said you manipulated the property line." "Let me guess," David said dryly. "The county rejected it." Instantly, his lawyer replied, laughing. "She's out of moves. But you might want to prepare for one more tantrum." "She's welcome to try," David said, though he couldn't shake the sense that something bigger was coming. Sure enough, 2 days later, he woke to the sound of heavy machinery again. This time it wasn't in his yard. It was across the street. Karen had hired construction workers, telling them she was redesigning her landscape. But when David looked closer, he realized what she was really doing. She was digging trenches near the new property line, trying to block water drainage from his side of the yard. It was petty revenge. She wanted to flood his lawn whenever it rained. David didn't get angry. He simply documented everything, videos, photos, timestamps, and sent them to his lawyer. Within a day, a county inspector visited the site. When Karen saw the county truck pull up, she ran out, trying to charm her way through. "It's just a small landscaping project," she said. The inspector shook his head. "This is an authorized excavation near a legal boundary. You're in violation again. You can't prove that, she snapped. Actually, the inspector said, holding up a file, your neighbor already did. She turned toward David, her eyes blazing, but this time he didn't flinch. The inspector gave her a notice and a fine for property tampering. It was steep, nearly $3,000. She tried to argue, but the inspector was firm. When he left, she stood frozen in her driveway, gripping the paper, her face pale. David walked past her on his way to check his mailbox. You really should stop testing boundaries, he said quietly. They don't move as easily as fences. She didn't reply. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. That night, the neighborhood was unusually silent. No music from Karen's porch, no lights on her patio. Her perfect image had crumbled completely. Inside, David sat by the window, watching the moon reflect on the lake. He had learned something through all of this, that revenge didn't need shouting or destruction. The best kind of justice was quiet, patient, and perfectly legal. He smiled faintly as the wind rustled through the trees where his new fence would soon stand. The fence she thought she had erased was about to come back stronger, taller, and planted firmly on ground she no longer owned. The final blow, the morning sun spilled across the lake, lighting up the neighborhood that had grown strangely silent over the last few days. Everyone knew what had happened between David and Karen, and no one dared take her side anymore. Even her so-called friends had stopped visiting. The once proud woman who strutted around giving orders now kept her blinds shut and her car parked in the same spot, too ashamed to show her face. But David wasn't celebrating. He was preparing. The final step of his plan was in motion. He had already scheduled the construction crew to rebuild the fence, this time taller, stronger, and right on the new legal property line. The permit was approved, the materials had arrived, and the work would start in 2 days. When Karen saw the delivery truck outside his house unloading wooden panels and steel posts, she came storming out in a fury. "You can't build that!" she shouted across the yard, her voice shrill. David, holding the new property map in his hand, didn't even flinch. "Actually, I can. And according to the county, this is exactly where it belongs." "It'll block my lake view again," she yelled. "That's your problem," he said calmly. "Not mine." "You're doing this just to spite me," she snapped. "No," he said, turning toward her. "I'm doing this because you thought laws didn't matter." Karen stood there shaking, her eyes blazing with humiliation and rage. "You're evil," she hissed. "I'm patient," he replied and walked back into his house. The next morning, the sound of hammers echoed across the street. The crew worked efficiently, installing sturdy metal posts deep into the ground. By noon, the skeleton of the new fence was already visible. Neighbors peeked from their windows, some quietly cheering inside. For years, Karen had terrorized them with complaints and fake violations, but now she was powerless. Every slam of the hammer felt like justice being built plank by plank. Karen couldn't stand it. She stood on her porch screaming at the workers, calling them names, threatening to call the HOA, the police, even the county again, but no one listened. The workers ignored her. David filmed everything just in case she tried something foolish again. By evening, half the fence was up. Its shadow fell across Karen's patio, cutting her once open lake view in half. She stared at it, shaking her head in disbelief, muttering to herself. That night, she did something desperate. Around midnight, David's security lights blinked on. The motion sensors had caught something. He checked the camera feed and saw Karen sneaking into the yard in her robe, holding a pair of garden shears. She was cutting at the base of the new fence panels, trying to loosen the bolts. David didn't rush outside. He watched quietly, recording every second. After 5 minutes, the lights on his porch flicked on automatically. Karen froze like a deer caught in headlights. David stepped outside, calm as ever, his phone still recording. "Working late, Karen," he said evenly. "You're trespassing again." "You can't prove anything," she stammered, backing away. "Actually, I can," he said, holding up the phone. "And the county sheriff's office can see it too." "You wouldn't dare," she said, her voice trembling. "You've already humiliated me enough." "You did that to yourself," he said. "Now go home before you add vandalism to your list of mistakes." She glared at him one last time, then turned and ran across the yard, disappearing into her house. The next morning, a police car arrived in the neighborhood. Karen was issued a formal warning for trespassing and property damage attempt. She tried to argue, but the officers had already watched the footage. They didn't even want to hear her excuses. When the police car drove away, she stood in her driveway crying, but David didn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. Actions had consequences, and she had written her own punishment. 2 days later, the fence was complete. It stretched from one side of the property to the other, tall and clean, its polished wood shining in the sunlight. It was stronger than the old one, anchored deep, built to last decades. When the last nail was hammered in, David stood by it, inspecting every inch. It was perfect. He thanked the crew, paid them generously, and watched as they packed up. Across the yard, Karen stood by her porch, silent this time. Her lake view was gone, replaced by the fence she had destroyed, now standing higher than ever. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the neighborhood. A few days later, the HOA called David to formally close the case. Mrs. Green sounded apologetic. "Mr. Turner, I want to thank you for your patience throughout this ordeal. We've decided to remove Mrs. Holt from the HOA board permanently. You were right about everything." David simply said, "Thank you. I just wanted peace." "Well," Mrs. Green added with a small laugh, "you've definitely earned it." News of Karen's downfall spread fast. She became the story everyone told new homeowners, a warning about what happens when arrogance meets the wrong neighbor. Even months later, when David walked by, people would smile and greet him, saying, "You're the guy who stood up to her, right?" He'd only nod, never boasting about it. He wasn't proud of hurting anyone. He was proud of protecting what was his. Weeks passed, and Karen's house grew quieter. She put up for sale signs, but no one bought it. People didn't want to live next to the man she had tried to ruin, and they didn't want to deal with her reputation either. Eventually, one morning, David saw a moving truck outside her house. Karen supervised quietly, her head down as workers loaded boxes. When she looked across the yard one last time, their eyes met. She didn't say a word. David just nodded once, and she turned away, climbing into her car. As the truck pulled off, he felt a strange mix of satisfaction and closure. The war was finally over. That evening, as the sun set behind his new fence, David sat on his porch, sipping coffee. The air felt clean again, peaceful, untouched by arrogance. He looked at the tall wooden barrier gleaming in the fading light and smiled. It wasn't just a fence. It was a reminder that no matter how loud or powerful someone thinks they are, truth and patience always win. The lake shimmered quietly beyond, the view still beautiful from where he sat today. He whispered to himself, "You wanted a view, Karen. Hope you enjoy the one in your rearview mirror." Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, and finally, after weeks of chaos, allowed himself to rest in the peace he had fought so hard to reclaim. The fence returns the morning after Karen's moving truck disappeared. The neighborhood felt lighter, like a storm had finally cleared. The birds were back on the fence posts, the air smelled fresher, and even the lake seemed calmer. David stood on his porch, sipping his coffee as the sunlight touched the new fence, its polished surface glowing softly in gold. For the first time in months, his home felt like home again. No shouting, no HOA calls, no fake letters slipped under his door. Just peace. He had rebuilt everything she tried to take, not just the fence, but his calm, his boundaries, and his dignity. A few neighbors stopped by that morning. Mrs. Green from the HOA walked up his driveway, holding a small envelope. "Mr. Turner," she said warmly, "I just wanted to deliver this personally. It's your reimbursement for legal fees. The board voted unanimously in your favor." David smiled faintly and took it. "Appreciate it," he said. She looked at the new fence, her eyes full of approval. "It's beautiful," she said. "Stronger than the last one." It had to be, he replied quietly. The last one fell to arrogance. This one stands on principle. She nodded. The community owes you more than you know. People will think twice before crossing lines now. After she left, more neighbors came by, Mr. Lopez, the older couple from across the lake, even the mailman who'd watched the drama unfold week after week. They all had something kind to say. You handled it like a gentleman, one said. She got what she deserved, another added. But David didn't gloat. He simply thanked them all, smiled, and went back to tending his lawn. He wasn't the kind of man who celebrated someone else's downfall, even if she'd earned it. He just wanted quiet. That afternoon, as he worked near the new fence, he noticed something half buried in the dirt by the corner post. An old wooden splinter, gray and weathered. It was a piece of his original fence. He picked it up slowly, turning it over in his hand. That fence had stood for 10 years, marking the line between respect and invasion. When Karen tore it down, she thought she could erase that line forever. Instead, she had taught everyone what it truly meant to cross one. He placed the splinter in his pocket, a small reminder of what patience could build and pride could destroy. Later that evening, the sun began to set over the lake, casting long shadows across the yard. The reflection of the fence shimmered on the water like a ribbon of gold, solid and unwavering. David sat on his porch with his coffee, the same way he used to before all of this began. The peace he felt wasn't just quiet, it was earned. His phone buzzed. It was a message from his lawyer. County officially closed the case. Property line permanently registered in your name. Congratulations, Mr. Turner. He smiled, setting the phone aside. The fight was over, completely and finally. Yet as he sat there, he couldn't help but think of Karen. Pride had destroyed her. She had everything, a big house, a perfect view, influence in the HOA. But she lost it all because she couldn't respect a simple boundary. David didn't hate her. He didn't even feel anger anymore. He just felt pity. Some people needed to lose everything to understand what they had. Days turned into weeks, and life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. New families moved in down the street, children played near the lake, and the sound of laughter replaced the tension that had hung for so long. Sometimes, people still asked David about what happened. Is it true she bulldozed your fence? They'd ask, half in disbelief, half in amusement. He would just chuckle and say, yeah, but she forgot that boundaries aren't built with wood. They're built with respect. One afternoon, while trimming his hedges, a moving van appeared across the street. A young couple stepped out, the new owners of Karen's old house. They waved to David. Hi, neighbor, the woman called out cheerfully. Hi there, he said, waving back. Welcome to the neighborhood. The man smiled. We heard stories about this place. Something about a fence. David grinned. Ah, that. Let's just say it's stronger than it looks. They laughed, and he helped them carry a few boxes. It felt good to see that house finally filled with people who wanted peace, not power. That evening, when the stars began to appear, David sat outside again, leaning back in his chair. The new neighbors' laughter drifted through the cool night air, mixing with the soft sound of crickets. He looked at the fence again, standing tall between his yard and the lake, and thought about how far things had come. The story had started with destruction but ended with restoration. His fence wasn't just wood and nails. It was a symbol of patience, justice, and the quiet strength of standing your ground. As the wind rustled through the trees, he whispered to himself, You wanted a view, Karen. You got one. But I got peace. The moonlight shimmered across the water, reflecting the outline of the fence, straight, unbroken, proud. And in that moment, David finally felt what he had been fighting for all along. Not victory, not revenge, but the simple, silent satisfaction of knowing he had done the right thing. The world around him was calm again, and so was he. The fence stood where it belonged, guarding not just his property but his peace of mind. And as the night deepened, David smiled quietly, thinking, some fences are worth rebuilding, not to keep people out, but to remind them where respect begins.